Number 10. Property. It should be no surprise to anyone watching this today, but women's rights and the treatment of women was not everyone's priority in the medieval ages. Dudes were just mean. I'm sorry. Where did it all stem from? I'm not sure. I'm just a guy with blue eyes, and sometimes I say funny stuff. But what I do know is that women were treated more like men's property, which is that sucks. That's gross. No one likes that. Which they are not, thank you very much. Sometimes women were traded like currency for livestock animals, land, and just business dealings in general, because women didn't have a say in the matter. Like, I'll give you 2 goats for my daughter. Here you go, dude. Which is just, that's not a fair deal, dude. That's not a trade, man. Not a trade. Number 9. Promising young woman. Remember when I said if I talk about medieval times, I was gonna bring this up? It's a classic. A medieval staple. Couldn't talk about medieval times without it, really. What am I getting at? Well, that's marrying a woman in her midlife. About 12 years old. Yeah, I know. It's gross. Deplorable, despicable, naughty, and just unsavory. Okay, so people only lived to their mid-30s and 40s back then, so time is of the essence. Sure, I get it, but come on, man. I am hereby banning any cradle robbing or diaper sniping. That includes the dudes who out of high school and they're dating a woman still in high school. I'm banning it. That's it. Chetty says no. Number 8. Bedroom watch party. Okay, let me paint the scene for you. It's 2009. You just finished pre-drinking and watching the latest episode of Jersey Shore with your friends. There's enough hair product in your hair to keep a bowl of lime jello still. You slap on some Uggs and head to the club. You meet someone who's cute AF. Maybe it's the tequila, maybe it's the apple bottom jeans, but you want to come home with this person. Instead of making it to your bedroom, a bathroom nightclub is now your domain for love. People walk by and witness your actions, but you do not care because this is your life and it's 2009 and you can do whatever you want. Okay, so that, but medieval times. Yeah, it's not a nightclub, but people would just come into your bedroom to witness that you went through with it on the marriage. Nobody wants that. That's just weird. That's not normal. Come on in. Me and my wife are about to... Come on in. Number 7. The Hunger Games. In the not so common case of a woman trying to divorce her husband because, you know, she's most likely not being treated very well and she's just not allowed to divorce, and it's really just a messy time for women. How do you lose a woman? You forget to cherish her. Or you fight in combat to determine who wins the divorce. And by winning the divorce, I mean whoever wins lives. Yes, this was something that was actually done in medieval Germany. Basically, there's a little arena. Husband gets put into a hole to make it fair, I guess. There's a sack of rocks and a club, and then you just full send it and start swinging at each other. I feel like most divorces suck. Not that I would know, I've never been married, but I mean, come on, are the married people really telling me at home right now that they want to swing rocks and clubs at each other? I don't think so. Number 6. Gross. Genghis Khan, maybe the most down bad dude to ever get on a horse and do what he did. Well, maybe except Arthur Morgan, but he's not real, even though I wish that chiseled, handsome, rugged man was. Despite my daydreaming fantasies, I'm here to talk about a really bad dude, Genghis Khan, medieval conqueror and womanizer. He had so many wives, who a good portion of which were forced at sword point to be his wife, and husband and wives were not exactly sitting around the couch watching news together back then. They did the deed, whether or not both partners signed off on it. What I'm getting at is he had so many offspring that his DNA is still with us today. 0.5% of the male population on Earth are descendants of the Mongol warrior. That's over 60 million dudes. That's just insane, bro.
Number 5. Fear the Dead. With The Walking Dead on their 47th season, I think it's time to take a peek into zombie history, shall we? And find out where this grim idea really started. Well, it's certainly not a new one, I'll tell you that for free. As far back as the early 1300s, residents were buried in the village of Warren Percy, where archaeologists discovered them many moons later, and they discovered marks on their bones. Cuts, burn marks, you name it. Apparently this was all done after they had passed away. But why? Scientists believe that these injuries inflicted after their untimely death were to prevent them from being reanimated, you know, coming back to life and haunting your village. To keep them in their graves, of course. Unless this dude did something to piss off an entire village that much, they were clearly afraid of this corpse coming back to haunt them. Number 4.
Studia Generale. This period also saw the birth of what we call the modern university. This was a culmination of material translated and taught to provide a new infrastructure to scientific scholars. Some of these new universities were registered by the Holy Roman Empire as an institution of international excellence, giving it the title Studium Generale, or better known as Studia Generale. Most of the early Studia Generale were discovered in Italy, Spain, England, and France. These places of study were considered the most prestigious places of learning in all of Europe. I bet you the school hoodies were still so expensive. Just someone's old textbook with a mustache drawn on Marcus Aurelius. The listed number of institutions began to grow as new universities were founded throughout Europe. As early as the 13th century, scholars from the Studia Generale were encouraged to speak and lecture courses at other institutions within Europe to share documents and information, which led to the current academic culture seen in modern universities today. It's a TED Talk, come on. There had to be one cool professor back then, like the guy who lets the class teach itself, orders pizza, has tenure, and hates the monarchy.
Number 3, medieval taverns. Say you want to grab a pint with the local lads. Where do you get an IPA in the Dark Ages? Where do we get a 6-pack of Arthurian ale? Well, this is the medieval ages, so instead of venturing through the woods to hopefully maybe find another town, just ask thy neighbor. That's right, in the Middle Ages, you could brew your own ale. No problem, no one's asking any questions. Give it a shot. In the late 12th century, baking bread was not freely permitted, but making ale in your basement was. I guess that's great. So the higher ups, the noble lords, they wouldn't care if you made ale and had a block party, but if you made a weak ale, or it was improperly measured and then distributed, then, and only then, do you get a fine. Arrest this man at once.
Number 2, St. Patrick. St. Patrick was a 5th century Roman British Christian missionary and bishop in Ireland. Also known as the Apostle of Ireland, although he is the first apostle, having lived prior to the current laws of the Catholic Church. He is considered a saint in the Catholic Church and is regarded as the enlightener of Ireland. The dates of Patrick's life are not certain, but there is a consensus that he was active in Ireland during the 5th century, making his rounds as a missionary, speaking the good word of God. But let's get into what everyone talks about with this guy. The good stuff, like slamming a green Guinness or getting all the snakes out of Ireland. I mean, I love the structure and the faith and stuff, but also chasing every snake out of an entire country with a walking stick.
Shoo! Shoo, you fool, you bleeding bleeder. Go! Go!
Do you know how big Ireland is? St. Patrick's Day is on March 17th, the supposed date of his death in 461 AD. It is enjoyed inside and outside Ireland as a religious and cultural holiday and remains a celebration of Ireland itself.
And finally, number 1, dancing plague. A medieval plague, but make it groovy. Yeah, let's start dancing. That's right, the dancing plague. This was a real danger back in 1518. I'll try not to laugh, but I'll try. This was perhaps one of the weirdest events in history. Fra Trofea was the first victim of said plague. She was moving her body around frantically, so much so that it resembled a dance or something, in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. And as if that wasn't weird already, dozens of others began to join. And then more, all moving their bodies with a similar, wacky, frantic twist. This was long before Chubby Checker came along, so we still have no idea what was going on here. Like, we're out of guesses at this point. This twist lasted for months. People were dropping on the spot. It was scary and confusing. In total, there were around 400 victims that fell to this mysterious illness. That's a lot of deaths. That's a lot of real deaths. This was documented in 16th century historical records, so I don't think the story is made up per se. No one would make this up. It's terrifying. A Catholic saint at the time, Saint Vitus, was believed to have the power to curse people with said dancing plague. What an amazing power also. Guy starts moonwalking away, you're like, beat it. Some suggest this was a cult, others believe they ate toxic rye. Who's to say for sure? Either way, we're all dancing.
Rome really had existed as nothing but a name by the time the empire falls on September 4th of 476, having been falling inwards on itself for just short of a century at that point. So started the periods between the 5th and the 15th centuries known as the Middle Ages. This time can be split into 3 main sections: the early Middle Ages, aka the Dark Ages, High Middle Ages, and Late Middle Ages. One of the most famous events from the entirety of the Middle Era was truly kicking some ass in the Dark Ages, and it was the Black Death. Something that nobody gets anymore, with exception for a cool 20,000 some odd people between 2000 and 2009, and 56 people in the United States in the last few years. But if we pretend that we don't know that, and if we can avoid chipmunks like the effing plague carrying hairbringers of death they are, then we most likely don't have to worry. But travel back in time, say to the 800s or even 1340s Europe, and your chances of surviving are somewhere between 7 in 10 and 2 in 5. Black Death killed as much as 60% of the entire population of Europe. So when you're at work looking around but with those blank dead fish eyes, bored, cross off every third person you see in a pattern of 5 and try to figure out how many of them are gone and who you'd manage without. Probably now being in a position to go, hey boss, looks like you need new middle management team, and ain't since nobody left, hooray, promotion. That's exactly what happened in the Middle Ages too. After half the world died, kinda changed the balance of power. Suddenly peasants could ask for pay raises and improvements in working conditions, and life got a little better for them. This was further developed by the evolution of feudalism, and as a result the first banks and widespread money supply appeared for the first time in Europe. RIP freedom, hello capitalism. And speaking of the workforce, how about their dirty jobs? Knight, tosher, rat catcher, oh my, there's no shortage of terrible jobs in the Dark Ages. So let's cover a few. So a leech collector was a woman's role. She was often living in the countryside near marshes and bogs, just generally dirty open water spots where she could strip her legs bare, grab a bucket, and wade into the mud, waiting for leeches to sucker themselves on. At that point she could scrape the buggers off, bucket them, and then sell them in town to physicians, the wealthy people, beauty stores, whatever. Enjoy the scabs and infectious diseases. The groom of the stool was a position for the royal household who was in charge of cleaning the king's badunkadunk, making sure it was clean and dry post his kingly, well, dumps. Tanning leather seems like it would just be hard. Don't worry, on top of stripping animal skin of its fur, soaking it, and consequently yourself in lots of lime and salt, it also involved animal feces. See, you'd hire this other guy who somehow had a worse job than you. He's called a pure collector. He'd collect you dog poop, you'd grab it with your bare hands and mush it into leather to treat it. And don't get started on lime burners or treadmill operators, which was essentially a 50-50 death sentence job. And usually whatever job you ended up with was one for life, because chances are you stay in one place. Many people dream of traveling. My generation especially is one that's opting out of children in order to do so. This isn't new, and the human desire to travel and learn is something inherent, coming with curiosity and the need to discover. But this wasn't one of those times. Written records show that a sizable proportion of people not only didn't travel to other countries, they never even left their region or the village they were born in. Even if you did manage to travel, it wasn't planes and annoying but passable airport waits. The average traveler would often sleep out in the open air. Inns or other forms of accommodation were few and far between, and usually too expensive for the typical person to afford. So aside from the super fun chance of freezing to death overnight, travelers in the Middle Ages also had to worry about being robbed or attacked on the road. Many people therefore chose to travel in groups, but even then you weren't entirely safe. Your homies could turn on you at any second. Consider also that roads and pathways were rough, and this was a ridiculous era where even spraining an ankle could prove to be fatal. Then there's finally bridges, which are quite rare, especially outside of big cities, so you might have to cross rivers manually, and while they could memorize and recite Latin every day, these dummies couldn't swim. Drowning was all too commonplace. Even the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I died while attempting to cross a river. So if you're gonna live in one region, one city, and one house your whole life, naturally it would be a dingy shack. Because peasants' homes were small, often just made up of one room. They were constructed of wattle and daub, a type of method of constructing walls in which vertical wooden stakes, or wattles, are woven with horizontal twigs and branches, and then daubed with clay or mud. Then they'd have a thatched roof to boot. And if they're well constructed, these bad boys could be waterproof and stand for a decent amount of time. But they required upkeep, and not everyone can afford that, especially seeing as it's essentially paper mache, twigs, and mud. You really had to stay on top of this. Inside of a hut, a third of the area was penned off for animals, which lived inside with the family. I know people that complain about the smell of a cat litter box. My guy, you could have had a whole donkey living next to the kitchen sink. Chickens, cows, pigs. Then, to really complement the mildew smell of rotting roof and the stink of sweat and feces covered animals, a fire burned in the hearth in the center of the hut so that the air was permanently eye-wateringly smoky. Furniture was maybe a couple stools, a trunk and bedding, and a few cooking pots. Beds were a thing, but they weren't very great. And don't forget a couple of dirty chamber pots kicking around the room. We may have discovered a new homing style, you guys. We could call it medieval open conceptualism with minimalism aesthetic. And when it's time to get your kid out of the house, you hook them up with an apprenticeship. The freaky Greekies weren't the only ones tossing their kids at other adults saying, here, take this and raise it. However, unlike the Greek apprenticeship, which came with some strings attached, as explained in the recent top 10 reasons why living in ancient Greece was impossible video, the Dark Age apprenticeship was truly and solely about work. But nobody said it was good or fair work. From the midpoint of the Middle Ages onward, master craftsmen were permitted to employ youngsters for free so long as they provided them with food, lodging, and formal training in their specific craft, which would undoubtedly elevate their status in the society. But getting through an apprenticeship was hard as hell. First, nobody said the food had to be quality, so rations often sucked and apprentices could effectively starve. But then there was the fact you could just get beat up by your master at any time, because it was literally expected of them to do that. Why? Because apprenticeships were ways of parents to get crappy, troublesome teens out of the house and learn some discipline in society. To add insult to injury, apprentices were stuck between childhood and adulthood by being teens. Because on one hand, a teen in medieval times would have been treated as an adult. On the other hand, privileges of adulthood, like the right to inherit money or ownership of land, didn't come into play until around age 21. So you're expected to be an adult, treated like a kid. Small wonder then that the tales of apprentices misbehaving badly are a staple of written accounts from the Middle Ages. Rather than dedicating themselves to their professional development, apprentices would often be found in pubs and brothels. Normal middle-aged teen activity.
Number 5. Joan of Arc. Finally, a woman in the Middle Ages. Who'da thunk? Joan of Arc was considered and still is revered the heroine of France for her role in the Siege of Orleans during France's 100-year war with England. Joan of Arc, a peasant with faith on her side, had believed that God had chosen her to lead France in victory against England and had spoken to her since she was young. At only age 17, she had stolen men's armors, a white horse, and like a Valkyrie riding into battle, she had convinced an entire army that she was appointed by God to win. And then did! That's the most badass thing I've ever heard in my entire life. After such a miraculous victory, her reputation spread among France, and upon her capture and death at 19, the Maid of Orleans herself would forever live on as one of the greatest saints and symbols of the country of France. Number 4. Henry V. Another war? All these people do is kill each other. Does anyone fish? Or golf? No one, huh? Just swords and heads, swords and heads. A history itself. This time, England beats France. King Henry V, Prince Hal himself, leans into his kingly duties, demolishing France in what Shakespeare would delve into years to come. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories and was one of the most important triumphs in the 100 Years' War. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Henry V, prologue. Good stuff. How come these guys didn't just like rap battle or play soccer or something? Like, an arrow right through the chest is way worse than a red card, just saying. Hey, speaking of soccer. Number 3, mob football. I'm not talking about the mafia. Put 1,000 on Brady, would you? I'm talking about mob football, also known as folk football. It's just like our modern day soccer. Town versus town. Except it has an unlimited amount of players. And there's only 2 rules to the game. Get the inflated pig's bladder over the opposing team's lines on the other side of town, and no murdering. I mean, I guess this is closer to rugby? Yeah, this is literally just rugby. This game was played competitively and eventually outlawed at Oxford University in 1555. Just a guy named Jeeves in a polo. Oh yeah, I play mob football at Oxford. Yeah, I'm also in a frat. This game got so out of hand it was banned numerous times in England. There is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls from which many evils may arise which God forbid. We command and forbid on behalf of the king, on pain of imprisonment, such game to be used in the city of the future. Thankfully this game has calmed down over the years and now has become the most popular played and watched game across the world. Go Liverpool! Number 2, the printing press. The printing press is a machine that was designed for the mass printing of text, mostly in form of books and newspapers. With an unknown date of origin, first invented in China, this machine, designed in the 15th century by Johannes Gutenberg, was a revolutionary new form of writing which would only change the direction of history with the mass production of uniform text. Long story short, people didn't have to get the world's worst wrist cramp writing Hamlet over and over again. To be, or not to be, 86 more folios? The alphabetical metal keys would be placed into the device and slammed into the paper, pressing ink upon the parchment. You know there's gotta be some books half written in purple ink because they just ran out of black. Come on, we've all been there. Ink's expensive. Number 1, William Shakespeare. The Bard himself, arguably the most influential writer of the English language. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford, England. One of the easiest ways we can look back into the dialogue and lifestyle used by the people living in the Middle Ages. This playwright documents the world in which he lives from 1564 to 1616. Due to Shakespeare's unbelievable talent for building and fabricating an array of diverse stories and characters via players, Modern day is able to see the Middle Ages and the similarities and differences the people were experiencing. His plays are based in the environment that they were written in. He writes about diseases, he writes about monarchy, he writes about women's rights. Okay, so no one actually got turned into a donkey by some fairies in the woods, but some of those wars actually did happen, and some of those kings and queens were really twisted. How this man created so many brilliant works and stories, all part of the mystery. What do you think? Genius? Or did the guy have some help? One man in his time plays many parts.
Starting us off is cutting-edge courtship, quite literally in this case. It was traditional in some Nordic countries to have courtship customs involving knives and daggers. This is due to sacrificial nature in their original belief. The purpose of a dagger is prevalent for that after all, but it was also due to its functionality. In Finland, when a girl came of age, her father let it be known that she was available for marriage by providing her with an empty sheath. The girl would wear an empty sheath attached to her girdle, skirt. If a suitor liked the girl, he would put a pukoko knife in that sheath, which the girl would keep if she was interested in him. If she wasn't, she could just toss that anywhere. The knives were often custom, so a man would be able to woo a woman with unique details and imagery on a blade, but could also offer an heirloom or traded blade. Seeing as women of the Nordic region didn't shy away from handwork such as farming, jewelry making, clay working, etching, clothiers, and even some positions like smelting, a blade was a thoughtful and convenient gift that also said, "I love you" a whole dagger's worth. Something so romantic about giving someone a gift they could quite literally kill you with. In the meantime, while the Scans are giving blades, the English are being taught the NoNo Days and the NoNo ways. In layman's terms, they were being told how to have intercourse and when. That just doesn't make for a fun title. You may be familiar with these laws and regulations. They've come up in some of our other medieval and Middle Age videos. This was a time period where the church had a lot to say in state affairs. Not to say that it doesn't now, but they were able to make determinations such as intercourse schedules around the religion. Real laws were in place that people could not have sex on Sundays, Thursdays, or Fridays due to religious reasons. Whenever a holiday had a fasting period, such as Lent, abstinence was expected then as well. If anyone was to deviate from the set rules by having intercourse, they were committing a grave sin. These laws were written in penitentials, which were books that indicated what was allowed under the church rules and what was not. Oral, backdoor, premarital, and self-inflicted intercourse were banned in these books. Now thankfully their wide-range taboos included some good stigmas to have, such as interbreeding, so that minimized people keeping it in the family and messing up our future populations. But even with sexual laws, men could be knaves, which is just an old-timely way of saying being a dog. Now, I'm not saying ladies couldn't have itchy feet and dog their way around too. We do it now and we've been doing it then, but it was a lot worse for ladies to be caught back then. So the general consensus is that it was rare, and when it did happen, it was usually affairs outside of a marriage. In general, young medieval daters had to be cautious. While peasant marriages were a little more than saying we're married most of the time, reputation, especially for a lady, was huge, as was virginal status. Men of higher status often sought out beautiful peasant girls for affairs. Sometimes they benefited the woman greatly and she'd become an heir to a status child, thus elevating her own. But for the most part, it was pure carnal enjoyment men were after, in a time when women were told to do the opposite. And so it became a game of men trying to win a single woman into doing the act. She had everything on the line while he usually had nothing. Secret flings were frowned upon, to say the least, and were often seen as a sign of potential trouble, hence the English ballad that would warn of knaves preying on young fair maidens at country fairs. A young woman caught having affairs was a wild scandal that could even be punished for or put to death, so making the decision to bow to a lord's or even a common man's pressure could quite literally destroy a woman's whole life and being. Yet it's still a decision women made. Hormones. Yet when it comes to marriage, it's always love versus politics. Medieval marriages tended to be negotiations, particularly around dowry, but it wasn't all about money. It was very important that a noble woman is a virgin at marriage purely out of pragmatic reasons. Marriage, after all, was an alliance union of two families that required healthy and admirable legitimate children to be truly locked in. It's for this reason, as well as the violent men in society, that the church's laws stated that the degree of pressure to encourage a marriage could not sway a constant man or woman, aka no forced consent. What was forced, however, was up to debate, so don't be too proud of them for having that law in place. A woman was able to call off her marriage up until it occurred for this reason, as was a man. Should this occur, dowry was either returned in full or only partially as a fee for the failed union. Alongside this was the courtly love direction romance and marriage began to take in the mid-ages, during a Shakespearean and theatrical influence. Marriage started to become idealized. We'll circle back to how this affected people later, but lower classes consistently did marry for love, since there's little to be gained materially from marrying for them. For most part, there was no official ceremony. That the social level marriage was more like, hey, we're married now and living together. By 1400 AD, AD, there were actually many laws decreeing marriages needed to start becoming a public affair, and one may wonder how often people did marry in secret. Next up, watch lords try to impress ladies with a lance measuring contest. As mentioned, courtly love and chivalry are important facets of medieval society and culture, and seeing as tournaments and displays of masculinity were centerpieces of this culture, it's no surprise it made its way into courting. By 12th century England, tournaments were in full swing, usually consisting of jousting and melees, a big organized throwdown between knights that were not expected to be dangerous but occasionally resulted in serious injury or death. These tournaments were respectable places to meet potential suitors, and singles flocked to these spots to watch heroic knights joust and parade themselves around while noble maidens looked on adoringly. Some contemporary conservative commentators, as well as the church, however, complained that the tournaments were places of frivolity, scandal, and lust. Buzzkills. Don't worry, if sword fighting isn't your forte, then poetry or songwriting were also popular ways to express your love to a lady.
In 5th place, we've got bad bread. In today's modern age, if bread starts looking funky, we tend to just, eat around it or toss it, but people didn't always have that awareness. Ergot is a fungus blight that forms hallucinogenic drugs in bread. Its victims can appear bewitched when they're actually just higher than a kite. It thrives in a cold winter followed by a wet spring. The victims of this might suffer from paranoia and hallucinations, twitches and spasms, cardiovascular trouble, and stillborn births. Now, this also seriously weakens the immune system. Human poisoning due to the consumption of rye bread made from ergot-infected grain was common in Europe in the Dark Ages. The first mention of a plague of gangrenous ergotism in Europe comes from Germany in 857, and following this, France and Scandinavia experienced similar outbreaks. England is noticeably absent from the historical regions affected by this, as its main source of food was wheat, which is resistant to the fungi. In 944, a massive outbreak of ergotism caused 40,000 deaths in the regions of Aquitaine, Limousin, Périgord, and Angoumoise in France. Ergotism is actually believed to have played a large role in witch hunts, since the symptoms of this poisoning and the signs of bewitchment are almost identical. Witch hunts hardly occurred where people didn't eat rye. Just saying. In 4th place, we have the Younglings of Woolpit. Those no words have thwarted my vocabulary again. How'd you guess? The legend of the Green Younglings has been told time and time again, and I'm surprised today's research was the first I've learned about them. A brother and sister duo were found near... take a guess? Yep, the village of Woolpit in the 12th century. Dang, y'all are good at these guessing games. They spoke in an unknown language and looked relatively normal, minus the green color of their skin. After being rescued, they refused to consume anything for several days until presented with raw broad beans, and eventually learned to eat other foods. Shortly after being baptized, the brother passed away. Okay, slightly suspicious, but the gal adjusted to her new life, and was considered very wanton and impudent. Simply put, in modern English, she had a mind of her own and refused to be docile. Atta girl! After she learned to speak English, the girl explained that she and her brother had come from a land where the sun never shined, everything was green, and the light was like twilight. I'm guessing they were living in some sort of forested environment, but maybe they were aliens? Hey look, with all the research I do on alien life, you cannot blame a gal for jumping to that conclusion. In 3rd place, we have divorce by combat. Yep, people could get divorced, but it was a heck of a process. Divorce by combat appears to have been a form of trial by combat, which was when accusations were dealt with between two parties where there were no witnesses or a confession. Whoever won the duel was deemed to be right. The rules for divorce by combat as we know it come from Hans Tellhofer's Fechtbuch, which was written in 1467 and are as follows. The man would be placed in a waist-height 1 meter deep hole with one hand tied behind his back, while the woman was allowed to move freely. Both parties wore practical clothes, which was described as a one-piece bodysuit with stirrup legs. The woman was armed with 3 rocks, each wrapped in a length of cloth to form a kind of swinging club. The man was given 3 normal clubs that matched the length of the woman's cloth to ensure that their ranges were equal. The man was not allowed to leave that hole, by the way. To further limit him, if he touched the edge of his hole with either his hand or his arm, he had to surrender one of his clubs. If the woman attacked him while he was surrendering his club, she in turn forfeited one of her rocks. Yes, the rules placed the man at a clear disadvantage, but it's important to remember that it is unlikely that the woman had any kind of combat training. Furthermore, in any kind of physical contest, it is likely that the male would have an advantage in size and strength. For that time period, not modern day. I watched WWE. Women can beat up men. So the handicaps placed upon the man were to try and make the fight as fair as possible. That's honestly pretty dang impressive for the time period. The conditions for victory are unclear. Some historians believed it was unlikely that fights were to the death. Instead, it was probably down to the judges to decide when one of the fighters had been incapacitated. Since both parties were hitting each other with big blunt objects, it seems likely that many trials ended with one party being knocked unconscious. Thankfully, divorces are mostly, a lot less lethal today. Look, I said mostly. In second place, we have methods of obtaining information. Nowadays, if one is in court and receives a sentence of any kind, it's usually, being detained to a prison or institution, charged a financial amount, or community service. But courts weren't always humane. Heck, this could probably make like a decent top 10 on its own, but I'll try to condense it today. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 1139 put it, courts hanged them by their thumbs, or by the head, and hung fires on their feet. They put knotted strings about their heads, and writhed them so that it went to the brain. Sometimes they put in a chest that was short and narrow and shallow, and put sharp stones therein, and pressed the man therein. I neither can nor may tell all the wounds or all the tortures which they inflicted on the wretched men in this land. Pressure devices from that time period can be classified in many ways, but I've managed to narrow it down somewhat. If they leave a mark or not, if they draw bodily fluid or not, physical versus psychological anguish, and if it was used to extract information or as an additional punishment to prolong death. During my research, I read up on over 50 different versions of heinous punishment, half of which include words I definitely can't say, and others that would send me retching if I tried to describe them here. You want me to try? Oh, okay. It's on y'all's conscience, so if anything happens to me. A cheap and popular way to end someone slowly was by forcing a rat through a victim's body as a way to escape a cage that they had been put in. Since y'all need detail so much, the rat was caged, not the human. Unless stopped almost immediately, this torture always resulted in eventual death. Once again, I could go on for hours if y'all really want me to, but I'm suddenly a little queasy and I'd like to keep my food in my stomach if you don't mind. In first place, we have people munching in ancient Egypt and Europe. Yeah, remember that list of no-no words? Yeah, here we go again. The question in old society was not should one consume human flesh, but how and what kind of flesh did you want to consume? Grave robbers were making bank, but sadly, no one was selling zydrate in a little glass vial. The answer at first was Egyptian mummy, which was crumbled up to stop internal red fluid release. Skull was one common ingredient, taken in powdered form to cure head ailments. One popular drink to cure apoplexy mixed powdered human skull and chocolate, while the most coveted remedy mixed skull with alcohol. Even the toupee of moss that grew over a buried skull, called usnea, became a prized additive, its powder believed to cure nosebleeds and possibly epilepsy. Human fat was used to treat the outside of the body. Red human fluid was procured as fresh as possible, while it was still thought to contain the vitality of the body. One physician even recommended drinking it fresh from a living donor. No, he was not accused of being a vampire. Shocking, I know. The poor, who couldn't always afford the processed compound sold in apothecaries, could gain the benefits by standing at executions, paying a small amount for a cup of the still warm life source of the condemned. Thanks. For those who prefer their redness cooked, a 1679 recipe from a France apothecary describes how to make it into marmalade. While I do fancy myself an amateur baker, I'll stick to my famed double chocolate cookies and mini egg dip.
Number 10. Treaty of Verdun. The Treaty of Verdun, or also known as Traité de Verdun, was a contract agreed on in August 843 in which divided the Frankish Empire into 3 kingdoms among the surviving sons of the Emperor Louis I, the firstborn son and heir of Charlemagne. Long story short, all the grandsons were all at civil war with each other about who was getting what did grant promise. The treaty followed shortly after almost 3 years of wars between the brothers. It was the first in a series of partitions contributing to the dissolution of Charlemagne's empire, and it is seen as a blueprint in which modern societies are based off of. Basically, the brothers all had to split what their grandfather had decreed his own into land. Lothair the First, coolest name, Charlemagne's eldest son, received Francia Media, or the Middle Frankish Kingdom. Louis II received Francia Orientalis, or the East Frank Kingdom. And Charles II received Francia Occidentalis, or the West Frankish Kingdom. You and I both know the youngest got the most. Come on, I'm just gonna say it right out. Everyone likes to talk about the eldest son this and the eldest son that, but we all know the baby gets whatever they want whenever they want, don't they, huh? I'm looking at you, Taylor. Come here, man.
It's true, man. The baby gets everything. Middle child, guy didn't even exist growing up. Didn't hear from him. Number 9, underground castle. Big Ched and I are currently replaying Ocarina of Time, so in honor of Hyrule, I gotta include this medieval castle. It was once a residence during the reign of King Henry III. This castle was actually discovered recently underneath a prison yard back in 2015. The old prison castle, we love those. Shawshank Redemption 2, Medieval Edition. Super recent discovery. Archaeologists discovered walls of a castle underneath the basketball court in southwest England at a former prison. Yeah, dudes were shooting threes over top a kingdom and they had no idea. How amazing is that? This was the same castle that played part in the mid-1100s during England's Civil War. The castle actually fell later in the 1400s and the prison was built on the grounds later in the 1700s until it closed its gates forever in 2013. And then we were shooting threes and then we discovered it, of course. If I was a ghost haunting these grounds, I would make every shot miss. Easily. I would just float near the net, tap the ball away. Like, nice try. Back to prison.
Number 8. Stonemasonry. So we all know about who wrote what and who translated what to what text and which language while writing what play, which was based on who. But who built all this stuff? When we think of the Dark Ages, we can't forget the megalithic Leviathan stones carved and molded together to create the enormous Gothic castles and cathedrals that are still standing to this day. How did people do it back then? Well, masons in medieval England were responsible for building. Masons were highly skilled craftsmen, and their trade was primarily used in the building of castles, churches, and cathedrals. There were 3 main classes of stonemasons. There was the apprentice, the journeyman, and the master mason. So what would a medieval construction site exactly look like? Well, of course, there's the master mason. He's usually the head and the overseer of the work, and he's the most skilled of the tradesmen. This is like the head honcho on site. We've all seen this guy walking around site. He's always angry, he's always yelling, "Hey, who's got the plans? You, give me those. What are these? Backwards, you idiot. I'm gonna put the window down there." So how did they exactly chisel out all of these castles from one giant rock? Well, they didn't. The stone had to be quarried first. From quarrymen. These were not masons. Their job was to get the stone for the masons to work on out of the ground. Local stone was used first, but occasionally stone could travel vast distances, even from other countries. So I gotta drag that boulder there all the way to Scotland? Okay. Some of the most beautiful architecture ever created can be still seen across Europe. The amount of time and skill it took for these people to have designed, constructed, and chiseled such megalithic sites still baffles me. I'd be trying to read the plan still. Oh, that's north. I got it. We're good.
Number 7, apple bobbing. In a time where bodies were literally piling up on the side of the road, I can't believe we got apple bobbing out of the whole ordeal. That's crazy. It seems like ill timing, but it is the Dark Ages. What can you do? Apples historically have always been a symbol of importance. The Greek golden apple started the Trojan War. Snow White's poison apple was a symbol of importance in literature and all that good stuff from growing up. And in the Middle Ages, apples were viewed as a symbol of romance and fertility. These things have roots, pun intended, of course. In medieval times, bobbing for apples was flirty. It was their version of speed dating, dare I say. What happened was all the leftover apples from the big harvest were then put into a big bucket. Each apple had a villager's name on it, and then maidens would have 3 chances. 3 chances to grab that apple with their teeth. 3 chances to win a date with the English Tad Hamilton. What a weird time. Can you imagine if this was in Game of Thrones? Reek is just shivering for 2 seasons, bobbing for Ramsay's Bolton apples. We're like, medieval times were dark. Holy shit.
Number 6. The feudal system, aka feudalism, was a form of structure system existing in medieval Europe in which people would work and fight for nobles who gave them protection and land in return. A social political system in which landowners would contractually bind tenants to exchange their goods, loyalty, and simple space for safety and comfort within the laws of those ruling. Basically, this is like our renter's agreement now. I'll give you a place to stay and some heat. You give me an unfathomable and overpriced amount of shillings for these extremely low ceilings. Yeah, talk about crooks, man. This system stayed in place for more than 1,000 years and managed to fizzle its way out of society somewhere in the 15th century. Not just anybody would ask to be signed to this deal. There was structure and there was order. There was a lord, aka the landowner, aka your landlord, allowing vassals, aka tenants, to rent the land by providing services, especially military services. Yeah, you can stay here, but once in a while we're gonna need you to dump a bunch of boiling water and over that wall. Is that cool? Yeah, you're fine with that. The plot of land, called a fief, was typically worked on by serfs who were laborers who had very few rights and were bound to the land itself. These were the lowest class of people, and they basically did any and all to stay safe on the lord's land. Jobs would include farming, jobs would include cleaning, and was a minimum of 3 days work to maintain in good standing and remain stationary. Sure, there was no dental or mental health days, but come on, a 3-day work week? Plant a couple carrots here and there? It doesn't seem that bad.
Number 5, license to pour. We got inns, we got taverns, so what else? Where can we get a pint in the 1500s? I am thirsty. Well, come the time of King Henry VII, these establishments were known as pubs. I know, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but this is the perfect time to talk about some early pub history. Why not? Just squeeze it in. By 1577, there were over 17,000 alehouses, 3,000 inns, 500 taverns, all throughout Old England. So that's one pub for every 200 people. That is so much ale. Oh my gosh, do they work here too? This is a lot. So in order for this to take off, an act was passed in 1552. Innkeepers needed a license, so you can no longer throw a sleeping bag down, make some questionable wine in your cellar, and then call it an inn. That's not how it works. We're not doing that. We're not going to your basement and sleeping and drinking your ale. It's not gonna fly anymore. Show me some license. Show me some licenses. Number 4, cherry brandy. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're a noble or a knight or whatever, everybody wants to go to the pub and loosen up, especially a young Prince Charles. Back in the day, he would often visit the local Stornoway Harbor Village pub. So yeah, you would walk up, sit next to a prince and be like, "Hi, can I buy you a drink? What's going on here?" He would often order from the bartender in a soft voice a cherry brandy. This prince was being discreet, but unfortunately a local reporter just happened to be sipping some crispy cold ones at the same time and overheard this guy getting his whistle wet. So now it was of course a huge scandal. A prince drinking, having fun? Number 3, Tavern History. Before the Middle Ages, there were still taverns, places where alcohol was sold. Of course, this goes back thousands of years. Taverns, believe it or not, existed during ancient Roman days. In ancient Greece, the Lesh, which was a fancy club, it served food to its members as well as strangers. So it was the first tavern, essentially. Ancient Greek taverns as well. Imagine making ale in flip-flops and like a little toga. I'd be dancing around, it'd be so light and just, it wouldn't actually be horrible. It sounds like a horrible job. The Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylonia, so around 1750 BCE, even all the way back then, they had the death penalty in place for those who improperly diluted beer. Imagine losing your head because you threw in too many hops. Like, oops. You see him take a sip, he's like, you're like, please. Number 2, drink ale responsibly. The night is beginning to wind down. There's a guy in a piccolo playing Closing Time in the corner. It's time to hit the road. We're feeling it. Stools are going up. Some guy's wiping something off something. How dangerous are these drunken commutes at this point? Well, back in ye olden days, there wasn't a friendly server that made sure you had some water before calling you a cab. No, in the 14th century, ale was 3 gallons for a penny. Nobody was cutting you off. They're like, yep, keep going. Give us your pennies, sir. Down your throat. In 1276 in Elstow, a man named Osbert Lewale came home from a local tavern just extremely intoxicated, not looking good. So much so that he fell and hit his head on one of the many stones around his house, and then, well, Bob's your uncle. Yeah, get home safe. If you're gonna drink, do responsibly and get home completely safe. And finally, number 1, the ride home. Like I just said, this was a lawless time. People would go to the tavern, slam tons of ale, and then just ride a horse home. Like it was fine? Yeah, not a great idea at all. This is drunk driving back in the day. More often than not, these guys would fall off or get lost or pass out on their horse and just end up in a different place. Imagine an unconscious knight strolling through a village at 6 a.m. You're like, that's Eric. That's literally Prince Eric. He's gone. He's asleep. In the early 1300s, it was pretty common for your husband to just not return at all. He would just leave the bar with the lantern, not see the well in front of him, trip, fall in, and drown. Like, you couldn't see anything. There was street lights back then. What a way to go out. Horrible. There was one report of a man who was on his way home from the local tavern. He had to go to the washroom, break the seal. Classic. So he decided to pull over and then go and relieve himself in the pond. But during so, he fell in and then drowned. Yeah, so back then it was just a bunch of drunk guys walking around uneven roads. So yeah, accidents are bound to happen. Guy's not even intoxicated. He's like, God, this road sucks.
Number 10. The Doomsday Book, 1085. The Doomsday Book was created under William I, also known as William the Conqueror. Like, you're already the first, man. You don't need 2 names, come on. This guy basically drew up a book to document people's money so that he could tax them. Oh yeah, this is the very first time surveyors went town to town and recorded how much money you would owe for simply just doing you. Men would show up at your house asking how much money you made and document your spending habits. 5 shillings on groceries, huh? Okay. And 5 on that phone plan. Look, tax season's coming up, Arthur. It's not looking good, man. Talk about a bunch of crooks, huh? Imagine owing someone money for just trying to make an honest living. Yeah, thank God that didn't catch on, right guys? Oh, speaking of, I gotta phone H&R Block. Number 9. The Crusades. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for the proprietorship over sacred sites and the land in the East Mediterranean. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for proprietorship over sacred sites and land in the East Mediterranean. Wars that resulted in 6 million deaths. The Knights Templar, a brotherhood of highly trained soldiers horseback bashing their way through the East. These guys were the real deal, almost like the Navy SEALs of their time. We've seen these paintings. The elite fighting force with the red cross painted on their chests. I wonder if they had to do a Hell Week. These soldiers were the most trained and savage fighters in all the Christian armies. Richard I leading the 3rd and final crusade, earning him the name Richard the Lionheart. Back then the names were always something so aggressive and scary. It was never like Richard the Clownfish or Henry the Pygmy Goat. No, we need fear. Way more fear. Number 8. The Magna Carta. The year's 1215. We need some laws, people. This document was one of its kind. A document setting out the laws and limitations from the common man to King John himself. A legal system written down so that there are clear do's and don'ts. No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against except by the lawful judgment of his peers, and the law of the land. Did you get all that? Write that down. Except women, they don't have laws. And they can't act in plays. Sometimes people needed to face the music. And even animals. Huh? That's right, animals. Being tried in a court. A lively and popular event trying any law-breaking animal from goats to pigs to even chickens. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, did you, Mr. Feathersworth, peck the floor, yes or no? Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. My brain can't fathom this, guys. Number 7. The Battle of Bannockburn. This infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of the bloody war for independence. Basically, Scotland was like, yeah, we're gonna go over here and roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. A leader slowly rising the ranks, William Wallace, the guardian of the King of Scotland himself, holds off the English forces and is knighted a hero to Scotland. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also hated. He was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Like, why do you have to do all that after he dies? Like, he's dead. Not fun. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1314 with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence, adding like 45 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 6. The Black Death. Ooh, talk about a curveball. The year's 1348. People are saying things like, don't let the bed bugs bite. Clearly not a very clean and safe time. The Black Death, aka pestilence, aka the Great Mortality, or simply known as the Plague. Single-handedly the worst pandemic ever recorded in history, wiping out somewhere between 70 to 200 million people. Ooh, now I get where bless you comes from. Someone sneezed back then and everyone's dead at 14. This is where we see those doctors in the terrifying bird outfits with the long noses stuffed with garlic and herbs. Excuse me? Yeah, he's not wearing the mask. I'm just trying to watch a cat publicly get skinned. Yeah, 6 feet please. Some doctors prescribed urinating on a person so that the bad smell would drive out the infection. Can you imagine? Just a doctor writing you up a script and go ahead and pee on yourself about 4 to 5 times a day. Take with food. Should be gone early next week. And just let me put my mask back on here before you leave. There you are. The plague started in Europe in October 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Most sailors aboard the ships were already dead, but those who were still alive were covered head to toe in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Ugh. Sometimes the Black Death included fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, temporary loss in motor skills, and then of course, death.
Number 5. Bedchambers. Do I need to say more? Actually, yes. See, while the bedchamber was the place where the deed was done, those lucky servants that were allowed to actually stay in this room with their lords and ladies often slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets and soaking up the heat of the fireplace. The castle itself usually had a cold dampness about it, which sounds lovely. So there were often tapestries hanging on the walls to counteract this. The servants on the floor thing makes me think of when you had like sleepovers and you had to tiptoe through all your friends sleeping on the ground to leave the room. Number 4. Gatehouses. Now for a place with the least amount of holes. Actually, it probably had the most. The gatehouse was probably the most fortified structure in the castle. The holes we have here were for the sole purpose of hurling or shooting projectiles. Some were for traps and obstacles. The gatehouse was a house for the main weak spot of the castle, the front gate. And as such, it had to be the most defendable part of said castle. It was also usually the most lavish and ornate part of the castle. If you're inviting Lord Reginald from across the way to your castle, you want him walking through that front door thinking, hey, this guy could absolutely defend against me, but also he has impeccable taste. Number 3, the dungeon. You knew this was gonna be here. Don't pretend to be surprised. Well, guess what? It ain't as common as you might think. And it wasn't always a deep, dank cellar in the bottom of the castle. It actually started off as a prison in the tippy top of the tallest, safest tower. Apparently, keeping people in cells wasn't actually commonplace at first. You'd probably just, But, hey, when they did have dungeons, then yeah, they were pretty grim. They were always put in the coldest, darkest, most moist part of the castle. And they were usually just prisons. Number 2, Ublyat. Bouncing off the dungeon is a much smaller dungeon, and hey, another hole. Yep, this one is kind of worse than a latrine though. You see, this is a hole that they would actually put people in. Imagine being put in a hole in the ground, where it was too small for you to actually sit down, with a trapdoor on top, too high to reach. That's an oubliette. The word oubliette is actually from the French word to forget, which is what they'd do. They'd put you in this hole and then forget about you to die. Lovely, right? Number 1, torture rooms. Here we are. Now how many of you weirdos came here for this one? This room is separate from the dungeons usually, not always, but it was at least not very far. Still gotta keep your prisoners cold and dark as you make them squeal for the end, right? Wow, that was dark. This was the room where you'd keep all your favorite tools of the pain trade. Stretched, hung by your ankles, fire, tools of all kind. There were trap doors in some torture rooms too that would lead to dungeons or pools of water. Some torture rooms, like those during the Inquisition, had even thicker walls to keep the screams in. Some of these torture rooms weren't used as often as you think though, as merely having a torture room was enough to get prisoners to give you what you wanted. Alright, can we move on now please? Okay.
Kicking off our list in 10th place, we have a very weird dish. Thanks to a lexicon of interweb no-no words, I can't say the explicit name, so you'll have to pay very close attention to what I'm spelling out. As far back as history can go, food has been used for sustenance and entertainment. For many of us, we can't be content with the exact same thing every day. We'd grow sick of it, or even run out of a certain thing, making that unrealistic. Heck, we wouldn't have a cookbook industry if people didn't constantly want to change up their meals. Now back in the Dark Ages, people had to get creative with what they had, since importing and exporting goods from other countries was nowhere near what it is today. Coming up with a delicacy they called helmeted, naughty name for rooster that is also used for a phallus? Work with me here. This was done by stitching a rooster so it seemed to be riding atop a pig, with military regalia serving as decorative garnish. I'll stick with herbs for garnishing my meat. Thanks! In 9th place, time to talk about gargoyles. Not to go all hunchback on y'all, but they serve as more than just fascinating architecture. Sadly, they don't sing or talk as far as we know, but there's always hope they just keep it a secret. The term gargoyle comes from the French gargouille, which is the noise of both water and air mixing in the throat. In English, we know this as gargle. Gargoyles were originally designed in 13th century French architecture as a means of disposing of water. Think of them like the precursor to the gutter. Typically, a trough was cut into the back of the gargoyle, and rainwater was able to run off the roof and through the gargoyle's mouth. The longer the body of the gargoyle, the further the water was projected. This prevented water from running down the walls and causing damage to the buildings. I'm glad modern plumbing is a lot more progressive, since that could have definitely been brutal. However, some gargoyles had another function, warding off evil spirits outside of churches and cathedrals. According to French legend, Saint Romanus saved his country from a dragon named La Gargouille. After defeating the creature, Saint Romanus burned its body. However, since the dragon had possessed the ability to, breathe fire, its head and neck could not be burned. Therefore, they mounted La Gargouille's head on the wall of a church and used it to scare off harmful spirits. Most gargoyles are depicted as grotesque creatures, but it is said that, like snowflakes, you will never find two that are exactly alike. Feel free to travel the world and compare the ones that are still standing. I'll wait. In 8th place, we have Animal Court. Yep, Fido and Mittens could be dragged in front of a criminal court back in the day if they didn't follow animal law. There are records of at least 85 animal trials that took place during the Dark Ages, and the tales vary from the tragic to the absurd. By far the most serial offenders were pigs, accused and convicted of chewing off body parts and even eating tiny humans. Most were found guilty and sentenced to the rope necklace or being burned at the stake. In 1386, a convicted pig was dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, drawers, and a human mask for its execution. It wasn't just pigs that felt the hand of the law, though. In 1474, a court found a rooster guilty of the unnatural crime of laying an egg. Unwanted rats often found themselves on the receiving end of a strongly worded letter asking them to leave the premises, and curiously enough, there was a trial of dolphins in Marseille in 1596. Okay. However, not all of the trials ended in brutality. One donkey, which found herself the victim of unwanted advances, was proclaimed innocent after a strong recommendation from a convent's prior, declaring her to be a virtuous and well-behaved animal. If anyone wants to hold court for modern dogs that chew up furniture, be my guest. Not much surprises me anymore. In 7th place, we have the origin of nursery rhymes. I thought this one was common knowledge, but after talking with colleagues and friends, enough people didn't know about just how dark nursery rhymes can be, so ergo, this entry. Alrighty, hands up, who has sung Ring Around the Rosie? If you forget, we shall sing it together. Trust me, I've got this thing memorized thanks to my work in children's entertainment, so here goes. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Now let's break this down, shall we? Yeah, I know, I should be tried for my puns. A ring around a rosy is a rash, which is the sign of a plague. A pocket full of posies is to ward off the smell, and ashes are from burning bodies. Sure, children's fun. I've sang a version that continued to add on to the lyrics, going, skipping and singing, having lots of fun, laughing, running underneath the sun. And while I commend the attempt to try and make it more cheerful, personally it just felt a lot more demented. Another dark one is the classic London Bridge is Falling Down. No, don't worry, I'm not gonna sing again. I know, it's bad. It's a traditional English nursery rhyme and singing game about the dilapidation of London Bridge and attempts to repair it back in the Dark Ages. It dates back to bridge-related rhymes and games of that time. A well-known hypothesis is that the song refers to the burying, perhaps alive, of bodies in the foundations of the bridge. This theory was based on the idea that a bridge would collapse unless the body of a human sacrifice was buried in its foundations, and that the watchman is actually the human sacrifice who will then watch over the bridge. Oh, that sounds too far-fetched? Bodies were found beneath London Bridge in 2007 while building work was being carried out for the London Dungeons tourist attraction. I rest my case. In 6th place, we have an uncommon plague. I know, no one wants to hear about a plague ever again after recent history, but I promise this one isn't your typical version. The Dancing Plague of 1518, or the Dance Epidemic of 1518, was a case of dancing mania that occurred in what is now known as France from July until September of that year. The outbreak began when a woman by the name of Frau Tochofefa began to dance fervently in a street for a week straight. Soon, 36 others joined in on the dancing chaos, with the plague claiming 400 victims by August. By early September, the outbreak began to subside, as the dancers were sent to a mountain shrine to pray for absolution. Guess we found where Footloose took inspiration. It is unsure just how many, but a small number of victims did pass from this epidemic, which is wild. Historical documents, including physicians' notes, cathedral sermons, local and religious chronicles, and even notes issued by the city council, are clear that the victims danced, but it is not known why. There are many theories behind the phenomenon, the most popular being stress-induced mass hysteria. Other theories include ergot, which I'll touch on in just a moment, and religious explanations. It would be interesting to see if this ever pops up again in modern times. Hey, look, sometimes a gal just wants a flash dance moment without judgment, okay? Okay, fine, maybe me.
Number 5 is why women want to stay in religious favor. In medieval Europe, a device was literally invented for women who defied their religious beliefs. Pyramid-shaped and made of wood, the woman who dared to defy her god should fear this. See, they would bind the woman's hands and ankles and then sit one of her two openings on the peak of the pyramid. She would then be incapable of shifting her weight anywhere else and was forced to put her weight down on the tip. It would slowly slide upwards and inwards, and the longer she was pressed down on it, the more her body split apart. These women would be left for days on end sometimes on this device. The device's slow, agonizing death can be compared only to the shame it inflicted as well. The woman was stripped nude and forced to suffer this torture in public for all to see. Number 4 is harems. To start, the word harem is derived from the Arabic word harim, and it often means sacred, forbidden, and sometimes sanctuary. This was an accurate name as only women's household members and some related male members were allowed to enter a harem, which was an honored women's space. The harem was the ultimate symbol of a sultan's power. His ownership of women, mostly slaves, was a sign of wealth, power, and sexual prowess. The seclusion from public gaze also inflated this power more so. But a royal harem could be a place of filth and stink where chaos and emotions ran high. This was the price of being property. Used by the emperors and his sons, you could either be favored or so hated that one day you vanish and rumors of your exile whirl amongst your peers. These ladies usually did not have the liberty to move out of the harem as they liked, but inside the harem they could move around as they pleased. There was no sisterhood in them either. Socializing amongst themselves was usually not friendly, and jealousies were shown directly. Makes sense, as status and position of authority in the harem were determined by the place that they had in the emperor's favor, and to give the king his first male child was a great competition in this regard, resulted in unpleasantness through the royal harem. Everyone tried their best to please the emperor and turned her bad qualities like jealousy, aggression, or short-tempered attitude onto other women. Seeing as many of these women were stolen from outside the empire, let alone inside, frustration with language barrier and culture clash was also a huge source of contempt. Sometimes the women would lie to the sultan to have others disposed of, or they'd simply gang up on one another. Regardless, harems were places of drama, inequality, and a race to be favored as a ticket out of sexual servitude. Hidden sexuality is number 3. There were plenty of mainstream laws in medieval and Middle Europe against male homosexuality, and while it wasn't considered as serious, lesbianism still posed a threat to the ideals of a male-centric societal order. A law written in 1260 France stated that women caught engaging in homosexuality shall undergo mutilation on her first and second offense, and on her third she must be burned. This is one of the only laws to specify consequences for lesbianism, but the 13th century and Christian perspective of sex radicalized further into modesty. Lesbianism was equated to sodomy at that time point and therefore carried a similar sentence: death. There is sufficient evidence of lesbians in Middle Ages, most of which come from the church. Turns out many nuns were sexually active lesbians, and the church directly acknowledges their presence by having to pass laws establishing penalties for nuns caught having sexual relations with each other. So not only were they having sexual relations with each other, but it was enough that the church had to do something about it. For example, during the 8th century, Pope Gregory III gave penances of 160 days for unnatural female acts. Still, no torture or death though. This is because as long as phallus or other phallus-shaped objects weren't used or involved, the relationship wasn't considered real intercourse. Real intercourse involved procreation after all. So eventually, when Christianity upped the ante, however, any sexual act that caused pleasure, which now included lesbian intercourse or plain old self-stimulation, was now considered sin. So like most women of the Middle Ages, even bisexual and lesbian women had to settle down for a man at that point. Anyone who struggled with sexuality can imagine how dreadful it would be to live that way. Divorce was a nightmare, which is why it's number 2 in our countdown. Laws worldwide were unforgiving of divorces, literally always to the woman. In Chinese laws, a woman could only divorce her husband if he mistreated her family, not even her. He, on the other hand, could divorce her for anything. Some accepted grounds for divorce were failure to bear a son, evidence of being unfaithful, lack piety to the husband's parents, theft, suffering a virulent or infectious disease, jealousy, and talking too much. Pretty superficial list, but in Chinese society, divorce was a serious action with social repercussions for both parties, so consequently divorces were not as common as they may sound. She could not be divorced if she had no family to return to, or if she had gone through the 3-year mourning period for her husband's dead parents. And speaking of family, during the Han Dynasty, unmarried women brought a special tax on their family, and women with babies were given a 3-year exemption from the tax, and their husbands a 1 year. So there was a huge push to get married. Meanwhile, in medieval England, their similarities are stark. They too had a small number of divorces despite an expansive list of reasons to do so, such as there was a discovered blood relation between the individuals, or impotence, or fear used to obtain consent, marriages entered into under false pretenses, things like that. In many of these cases, the lack of sufficient evidence made them difficult to prove and thus deterred people from taking their cases to court. And number 1 is the tradition of foot binding. It existed for around 10 centuries, and there are women alive today who still have feet that are the result of feet binding. Foot binding involves systematically breaking the feet and shaping them inwards. This tradition started in the 5 Dynasties 10 states period of the 10th century, when beloved concubine of the emperor built a gilt lotus flower stage and performed a dance on bound hoof-shaped feet. Being a beloved concubine, the other concubines of the emperor attempted to imitate her feet to curry his favor. So, foot binding began within the royal court and spread through China as the next fashion fad. It's done in a ritualistic ceremony accompanied by a variety of traditions to ward off any bad luck. They began by tucking the toes under the feet and using a long, tight ribbon wrapped up to the ankle to hold it all in place. Anytime the foot grew, they broke it inwards more, a process usually taking 2 to 3 years. The foot would remain bound for the rest of a woman's life. There is a whole list of issues this caused. Outside of extreme agony and being a handicap, it caused some women pain for the rest of their life. Their walk was changed, as was their posture, and the idealism of a slim body to lighten the pressure on one's feet was all the rage. The binding of feet actually caused the women to develop strong muscles in their hips, thighs, and buttocks, so much that the characteristics were considered physically attractive to Chinese men of the area, aka the girlies were thick. When colonization came to China, Western women boycotted foot binding, going as far as to catch women with bound feet and cut off their bindings. A humiliation because these women would never ever show their bare feet to anyone, let alone even husbands. And many of these women lost their husbands when the Western boycott worked. A lot of girls who had had their feet bound in order to become marriageable suddenly found themselves abandoned by their husbands because foot binding was no longer fashionable at all.
Number 10. Saving your pee-pee. Back in the day, whole families, monasteries, and public meeting places would collect the pee-pee deposited in chamber pots throughout the day. Yummy! They would take the amassed forbidden lemonade and either donate it, or if they were feeling enterprising, they could sell the wee-wee to the town tanner or fuller. You see, the warm yellow liquid was used for the process of dyeing textiles and in the tanning of hides. Oh, and it was also used for cleaning clothes. Screw the smell of Tide and bounce dryer sheets, I'll take the smell of wetting the bed and Grandpa's favorite chair, thank you very much. Urine was also used by physicians at the time to tell the health of their patients. I do this too. You know when it's clear and you feel like you're the most hydrated guy around? It's nice. I definitely don't taste it like the physicians back then though, or Saul Goodman in season 5 of Better Call Saul. I'll stick with apple juice for my favorite yellowish drink, thanks.
Number 9, Belladonna, or commonly known as Deadly Nightshade. Now, what would our medieval ancestors be doing with such a lethal ingredient? Well, truth be told, it had a few uses. One of the more strange was for beauty. Belladonna had this strange effect on the pupils. The consumption of belladonna through eye drops, or a liquid, would result in dilated pupils, which for a long time in Europe was considered to be very beautiful. At least, it was considered beautiful. I don't know if that really is. The trouble, well, it's poison. It's like if you were complimenting me on my summer-ready body. Except I told you my secret was drinking Drano. To my surprise, however, this is an ingredient you can find today in certain medicines combined with other ingredients. In small doses, it makes it not harmful. I thought it would be fun to talk about all the side effects as fast as I can. Dry mouth, dry skin, inability to sweat, muscle spasms, blurred vision, enlarged pupils, hallucinations, inability to urinate, talk to Adam, convulsions, seizures, coma, acid reflux, fever, rapid heartbeat, gastrointestinal infection, high blood pressure, constipation, and more urination problems. Adam's the guy you need to talk to for that.
Number 8. Barber for a brain transplant. No, not actually. I don't think they even knew what a brain transplant was, let alone how to perform one. But in the Middle Ages, barbers were not just responsible for cutting your hair and giving monks that lovely bald thing going on top. No, they were also responsible for tending to the wounded after doing battle, taking care of the sick, and all the other medical services that the actual physicians were too good for. It's actually the reason we see those red and white spinning signs outside barbers, because it's symbolic of the bloody rags they would use to show that they could do the bloodletting required of monks in the Middle Ages. These barbers even formed a guild in the 13th century, lasting all the way up to the 18th century. Barbers are talented individuals. No one can cut my hair the way Tony does.
Number 7. Jesters. If you were to peer your nightshade eyes into a royal court, it might take a second because that stuff ain't good for you, you'll find a few things. First and foremost, you will see a king and his throne, the man who rules it all. Next to him would be a most beautiful queen, the woman who has it all. Hiding in the room upstairs are his mistresses. That's just how it goes. Loyal knights, advisors, cooks, everyone's here, as Mr. Sakurai would say, except for one missing person. Who? Me and Adam, the jesters. Oh, hi. Sorry. The jesters, the jokers. Yes, no royal court is the same without the jester. The jester's job was to jest, laugh. He's a ye olde comedian. Now, it might seem like it sucks, especially because, well, they wore strange attire and that hat was supposed to resemble that of an ass's ear or a donkey's ear, depending on what you want to say. But the jester possesses a unique power. No, not the power to fart on command, that's my power. The power to speak freely, or at least more freely than most. This was a time when speaking out against the king could lose your head. The jester could speak about the kings this way because, well, everything he said was taken as a joke. Some advice I think we could all take today.
Number 6. Everybody drinking. I recently went to go pick up some beers, and I went up to the cashier and I got my debit card out and prepped my ID. The cashier asked me, "How do you want to pay?" And I handed him my ID, being so accustomed to being confused for a prepubescent younger lad. He looked at me confused and said, "Nah, you're good, bro." And boom, embarrassment. This interaction would never take place back in the medieval times because literally everyone was able to drink. It was usually the case to drink beer or wine in place of clean water. Now they did have clean water before you all jump on me in the comments, but for when it wasn't on hand, beer and wine was accepted in its place. It was a common part of the medieval diet. I think they convinced themselves of this in the same way I tell myself it's okay to have another one. Well, it's made of grains with water, so that means it's healthy, right? Red wine is good for my heart, so drinking it right out of the bottle is okay, right? No, probably not.
Number 5, the moss. I ain't gonna come in here and tell you I know what it's like to be a woman or pretend I understand. There's been lots of great photos of humans that have been taken throughout history, but one that we miss for sure is when I was a kid and I learned what happens to women on those special couple days of every month. Not shock, just confusion. The look on my face, it was priceless. I wish y'all could have seen it. We got things mostly figured out now though, but think about the past. Medieval times, not an understanding time for ladies. There were just no products to help in that scenario. So, have you ever wondered what they did? I did. Weird thing to think, I guess, but oh well. Moss pads, yeah. Take some moss, you wrap it up in a cloth, bada bing, bada boom, now you're in business. Which actually is really smart when you think about it. I never would have thought of that, but I'm a dude, so I wouldn't think about that. I don't think about those big thinking thoughts and things sometimes. I'm just a big dumb guy. Number 4, witch hunt. This is also a time where if a woman speaks out of line, or does something to upset the feng shui of things, there's a good chance she will get labeled a witch and burned at the stake. This was becoming an issue because, well, it was becoming a witch hunt, meaning anything that was slightly not cool or basically anything people feared or disliked could be labeled witchcraft, and thus likely an innocent woman would be burned at the stake. I mean, it sounds like they had it down to a science, really. Woman does something crazy, we'll bring out the charcoal briquettes. No, see, that's not right. It's not like they could have done this amazing thing called investigate. You know, see if the woman was actually innocent or the claims that she was a witch because she wants to be paid a fair wage like a man. Doesn't really sound like witchcraft to me. Maybe don't be so hasty to bust out the pitch and torches. That's all I'm saying. Number 3, you gotta do what you gotta do. I know what it's like to be down on your luck. Trust me, it sucks. It's not fun. But you budget, save, and work hard. You'll be back in the black before you know it. Women of medieval times got up and went to work. The kind of work a lot of women were forced to do because of circumstances. The oldest profession in the book, selling booty. It's been happening since day one and it won't be going anywhere soon. Now, I'm not here to condemn that kind of work. And funny enough, in medieval times, it was considered to be an actual profession. I just feel if you're gonna be in that line of work, it should be your choice. I'm a Las Vegas kind of guy. I love gambling, boozing, and the freedom to do what you want after strolling out of a casino after too much drinking and gambling. If you know what I mean. Sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do to make the bread, and they just had to do what they had to do. And that's it. Number 2, Hell Hath No Fury. Princess Olga of Kiev was a prime example of hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Long story short, her husband was torn apart by trees. Some gruesome stuff. It was actually, if you look at it, it's not nice. So like the Sith on its worst behavior, she plotted her revenge. When 20 men she deemed were all responsible for her husband's passing were coming into town, she had a large ditch dug where they were buried alive. That is so heinous. I can't even. She then extended a welcome to more of the men responsible. When they arrived, she invited them to wash up in her bathhouse, where she had the doors locked and the place torched, like it was a witch hunt or something. Just had them cooked. Just cooked them up. But I mean, they burn women, so why not? Why not cook some dudes? Okay. Number 1. Honestly, who throws a shoe? If you've ever been to a wedding, then you've probably seen the bride throw a bouquet of flowers to waiting bridesmaids and other lucky ladies. Because the lady who catches the flowers is the next woman to be swept off her feet and to be married. Put a ring on it. Kind of ending on a wholesome note here, which is kind of nice, but it's still a little messed up. Hear me out. In medieval times, it wasn't flowers, it was shoes. At first, it doesn't seem so bad, right? Shoes. We'll throw some shoes around. Why not? Besides, the shoe being thrown too hard, you wouldn't want to catch a loaf on the side of the head. That would hurt. I think we forget how filthy our shoes can be. I mean, they walk through everything. Dirt, mud, blood, and if you're in medieval times, having a good old-fashioned wedding in the village probably meant some manure. Eesh. Well, I'm all about tradition, but maybe we could throw the flowers instead. They just smell better, and there's less poop.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have heresy. Okay, I can admit when I'm wrong, and in the last video last week, I messed up. I said the wrong word when talking about spoiled queens. You guys pointed it out. Yeah, I read your comments, okay? And now we're here to redeem ourselves. I'm learning, you're already smart, let's get into it. In medieval times, it could be dangerous to disagree. Nowadays, many people like to keep an open mind. There's so many cultures, beliefs, people think different things, and that is totally okay. But it absolutely was not okay in the Dark Ages. Oh no. In these times, if you held any kind of belief that could go against the teaching of the Christian church, you were seen as a heretic. Many leaders, whether kings or crusaders or even missionaries and merchants, especially from the late 11th century, fought to have Christianity take over in the Mediterranean world. People belonging to other faiths, such as Jewish and Muslim people, suffered persecution and expulsion. In England, there were massacres, and in the late 12th century, Edward I banned all Jewish people from England. I mean, this quite literally set the stage for the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, which was aimed at establishing Spain as a united single Christian faith. Wars in medieval Europe weren't just waged on people of different faiths, however, it was also aimed at some Christians who people believed to be heretics. This is all to say that heresy was a serious crime in these times, and thinking outside of what you were told to think at the time and what was accepted could have landed you a death sentence.
Number 9. Facial expressions. I can't grow facial hair. I'm not sure if you noticed that watching, but it's never happened. It's not gonna happen. Quite frankly, I don't have to worry about trimming a beard early in the morning, anything like that, which is fine, to be honest with you. I'm not really complaining. Back in the medieval ages, I would have been set. People would have been pretty, I don't know, would have been more than ideal. The no hair look was the way to do it. The forehead was seen as the central point of your face, so it was common back in the medieval times for individuals to pluck all of their eyelashes and remove their eyebrows completely. So people would just be looking at you like, nothing going on, no facial expressions, just bald everything. Many would go as far as to pluck their hairline back even further so they have the round, oval, queen bald look. Imagine that. Imagine everyone's bald in Game of Thrones. Think it'd still get the rankings that it does? Probably not. Probably not. Macy Williams is just...
In our number 8 spot today, we have Animal Court. The history of animals being put on trial goes back pretty far, as it is believed it has roots in ancient Athens, but it was definitely a common practice as recently as the 18th century. Courts would go after things like rats, weevils, flies, locusts, and serpents for damaging crops, and when punished, they weren't just liable for damages, they could be banished and excommunicated. Like, imagine trying to banish a fly. This isn't where it ends though. In civil criminal court, they'd have livestock being tried for violence against humans. Like, I'm sorry, Your Honor, my client could not tell the prosecution that she didn't want to be milked because she's a cow. Kicking was the only way. As an example of a real animal court case, let's take it back to 1457 France. Villagers in a town witnessed a sow and her 6 piglets attack and kill someone. Terrible story, sounds absolutely horrifying to have to witness. In this day and age, animal control would be called and all of those pigs would likely put down. But not in these times. When this happened, all the pigs were sent to court. Like real court. There was a judge, 2 prosecutors, 8 witnesses, and a defense attorney for the accused animals. Witnesses provided testimony that proved that the sow had most definitely attacked the person and was definitely responsible for the crime. The piglets, however, well, for them, testimony was a bit murkier. There wasn't a witness who actually saw any of the piglets do any actual attacking. They just had blood on them, which isn't necessarily a sign of their guilt, it just means that they were there. This is why the court, while they did sentence the sow to death, the piglets were exonerated for their role in the crime. It's very strange and now would be a very expensive system, but in those times it really did work for them.
Number 7. Inns and taverns. When we think of a medieval tavern or an inn, it's important to note the difference. Yes, there's drinking in both, and yes, both of them don't smell so great. But inns, their sole purpose was to house travelers comfortably, whereas a tavern, not so much housing, more rough housing, if anything, if you catch my drift. Say you're passing by one of these taverns, right, Saturday night, you feel like grabbing some questionable ale from some questionable establishment, well, you better come prepared. In the Middle Ages, you had to bring your own fork everywhere you went. Just one fork on your side, on your persons. That's so gross. We didn't have a guy sitting in booth 11 doing roll-ups all night, looking at you, just wishing that he didn't work there, right? This was the Middle Ages. You didn't have a fork. No one had forks. If you had a fork, you were lucky, right? You were the rich kid on the block with an in-ground pool. That was you if you had a fork. Steak knives also were only reserved for carvers, so until the 17th century, you were just poking around your meal until you had a bite-sized amount, and then you would choke on it because it's horrible. It's all chewy and horrible.
In our number 6 spot today, we have the filth. If you lived in a city during this time in history, it would have been an absolutely filthy place to be. I mean, human and rats lived in harmony. Not harmony, the plague, but things were so dirty rats were everywhere. Want to go swimming in the nice stream nearby? Well, good luck, because not only is that body of water used for dumping sewage, but it's also for the village's water supply to both drink and bathe in. Disease was plentiful, obviously, and it spread exceptionally quickly. Spreading disease was even easier considering how all of the homes were packed full of people and no one really knew anything about hygiene and the benefits yet. Health and otherwise. If you were to go out in the evening, especially at past curfew, it was also an insanely huge risk. Going out ran you the risk of getting killed or robbed with no police on the streets to help protect you at all. While city living provided a bit of safety in numbers situation compared to the countryside and also provided more opportunities to make money, it was still quite a risky place to live during the Dark Ages.
And having a crappy kid sucks even more so back then than now because of the baby gamble. Choosing, if a woman got to choose, to have a baby was a hell of a decision in the Dark Ages. Plagues, famines, messed up weather, just not the environment for it, let alone women being regarded as morally weak and they weren't allowed to do things that modern women take for granted, like getting a job, deciding who to marry, having opinions, wearing pants. Your only 2 options were to become a nun or marriage. No work, no single living in the country, you get 2 options. And even if you weren't the most devoutedly religious, none was safer, if not a better option. Childbirth and pregnancies would kill 1 out of every 3 women in the Dark Ages. Compare that to today's maternity mortality rate as 1 out of every 0.028% of women. The fact that the female population now is significantly more equal in numbers to men in comparison, I think the choice is spectacularly easy. According to the Raven Report, childbirth in the Middle Ages and the Tudor period were so dangerous, royal women were encouraged to write out their last will and testament well in advance to giving birth. Just imagine adding that to the baby to-do list under decorate nursery and sew onesies. But on the flip side, some men weren't exactly capable of popping out babies, thus the impotence trials. Modern time has counseling, understanding doctors, and little blue pills, all sorts of resources to help men with that issue. But the Middle Ages? Whew, don't expect any real sympathy, not from wives or the whole community. Conjugal duties are taken hella seriously, partially because everyone was frisky and they're locked into having just one person for the rest of their life. And it wasn't just men who had the right to ask their partners to perform. Wives could also demand intimacy, and failure to provide, well, buddy, you're getting served. And many recorded cases of women being granted divorce due to their husband's intimacy exist to prove it. And they were carried out in public. Whole Judge Judy style throwdowns called intimacy trials, where accused man was expected to perform in front of the jury. To be granted a divorce, the woman had to prove her man was unable to perform, which wouldn't be shocking when you have an entire village watching with bated breath, even if it wasn't an issue before. Don't worry, a dude could save himself the shame of an annulment by calling on special witnesses such as working girls or other women from the past who could attest his manly prowess. Any medieval lady capable of putting her husband through such a humiliating ritual was almost always from a wealthy family. Lawyers and expert physicians didn't come cheap, but at the end of the day, men were literally able to cut our faces off in public or throw us in a fire alive for not baking bread right, so guys, I don't really think you can complain about this too much. Laws like this are one of the many stupid details that could have you randomly imprisoned. Another one, stingy stripes. Living in the Dark Ages is impossible for a lot of reasons, but having to keep track of hundreds of stingy laws to ensure you don't get locked up over a mistake truly was one of the hardest factors. What was the wrong way to pray, the wrong hair, a mole in the wrong spot, a color only the king can wear, or how the simple act of wearing stripes could lead to your imprisonment or even death. Why? Because for some reason striped clothing were seen as a garment of the devil. Thus anyone caught wearing them would at best get an evil eye from people in the street, or at worst get a hemp necktie. From the year 1250 onwards, the only people who were caught wearing stripes were the lowest of the low in society. Working girls, handicapped, the ill, the orphaned. They would don striped outfits highlighting their status as outsiders. In 1295, Pope Boniface issued a papal decree banning religious orders from wearing any type of striped clothing. In the year 1310, in the French town of Rouen, for example, a local cobbler was condemned to death simply because he'd been caught wearing striped clothes. Crazily, even animals weren't exempt. Records show that zebras were called beasts of the devil, even though people in Europe had only ever heard reports of them and hadn't even seen one with their own eyes. You can see how these guys led to colonization, right? Ridiculous. With the dawn of the Enlightenment in Europe, the hatred of stripes eased and eventually disappeared, and many look on the phenomenon with confusion, and understandably so. Time for the Shrek references. It's ogres and pitchforks. More specifically, just the pitchforks, and less specifically, really just the farm tools in general. You guys know in the movies like Shrek, when the villagers all come carrying pitchforks and farm tools, and of all things, like, why that and not swords? First of all, swords are heavy, and who has that kicking around? Seriously. Secondly, noblemen could require all male peasants over the age of 18 to report for military service. Didn't matter if it was a justified war against a viable external threat or just a petty fight against a local rival. If you are called up for duty, you had to report. According to histories of the time, around 1 in 5 peasant men would be in a military service. Food and clean water were in short supply, and disease was rife. Some historians reckon 2/3 of all conscripted men who died were killed by unsanitary conditions of their own camps over any enemy action. But peasants were required to bring their own weapons. Moreover, they would rarely receive anything more than rudimentary training, so they're sent to war unprepared and ill-equipped. Thus the thought process, well, if this tool works on my farm, for this, it'll work for that. So, what really sucked about military service in medieval times is how little was in for it for you. These days, joining the military can be a way of learning a trade or generally improving your lot in life. Not so back then. Feudal lords were fearful of their peasants getting too powerful, so you're once a farmer, you're staying one. If a peasant soldier got too skillful on the field of battle, there were several cases of them ending up mysteriously dead. It's like getting a Journalist of the Year award from the CIA. And finally, it wasn't just living that was impossible, but death sucked too. Alright, so evidently, whether from this video, others, or general universal knowledge, Dark Ages was pretty grim reality to live in. It's short, dirty, desolate, and brutal. But when it wasn't short, it was somehow worse. See, anyone over the age of 50, which was a crazy age achievement at the time, was deemed elderly. Unlike other cultures existing at the time, elderly in Europe are not even close to revered or respected. You didn't get to retire, having to pay your own way and continuing to work until physically you simply couldn't. Then, yeah, after that, you're really just a burden. Your own kids are side-eyeing you and everyone's asking you why you haven't died yet. What's the big hold up here, guys? For many, death was the only real chance to escape from everyday hardships or working the fields and trying to get enough money and food to survive. And when that finally happens and you pass through and rejoin the energies of our earth, you will finally find your peace. Yeah, no, psych, that still didn't happen. According to some research in Europe during the Middle Ages, massive 40% of graves were disturbed. Now, this wasn't like grave robbing during the Enlightenment Enlightenment. There were no university medical schools paying good money for fresh corpses to study. Rather, most cases of grave disturbances were run-of-the-mill theft. Often people would be buried with a small selection of their possessions, perhaps a favorite cup, a locket, a stuffed animal toy, or other such trinkets. In tough times, even some dead person's mystery grave junk might be enough to tempt a broke thief to dig someone up. However, this wasn't always the case. There's some even weirder crap too. Archaeologists in England have found evidence to suggest that in dozens upon dozens of quote grave robbing cases, rather than looking for objects, those responsible bound and gagged the dead bodies and then left them like that. It seems like they're fearful of restless souls, or perhaps of the undead rising again. Who knows, they had a lot of problems back then. So, in at number 10, we have witch marking. I'm trying to avoid some things we've already covered in similar videos, so while we've discussed witches, let's talk about witch marks. So during the English and Scottish witch hunt days, there was a belief that witches always had a natural skin mark. This could be a mole, or a scar, or a pock mark, or even a really bad zit. So when they came across a woman whom they thought were a witch, but she didn't have any of those markers, that was the end of it, right? She isn't a witch? Well, no, they gave her a skin mark instead, specifically by using a pricking needle which the witch hunters would carry. These needles repeatedly pricked the flesh of the accused until it produced the result that wouldn't bleed but was insensitive to pain, which fulfilled the criteria of a witch's mark. It's a subtle punishment for something that they were yet to be accused of, because by giving them the mark, they could now accuse them. These witch hunt days were a whole mess. Number 9 is marking your territory. Not in a cool, sexy, I got a tattoo way, more in a Scarlet Letter kind of way. As you'll learn in this video, a woman who cheated or even was single and just engaged in intercourse of her own free will could be classified as a sinful adulterer and cheater and be punished, usually a lot worse than a man. So when Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote the Scarlet Letter, he took inspiration from real life events. The letter, which for the character Hester Prynne was just a red A, was usually the letters AD, which stands for adultery, as outlined by the Plymouth Colony Law in 1658. Multiple accounts across Europe verify that someone who was being marked was to be seen out in public without it, could be subject to public whipping and other public humiliations that ensured a person's social alienation. Like in the Scarlet Letter, when Puritan minister Arthur refuses to admit his sinful side of the act with Hester, he's branded with an A in his chest. In a man's case, while this was of course painful, it was allowed to be hidden. He also didn't have to face the societal consequences the way any woman would have. For number 8, we travel to discuss status degradation. While it still persists today, not everyone knows what it means. So essentially, you do something wrong, oopsies, you lose some of your basic human rights. You could steal something, have relations out of wedlock, cheat on your partner, miss some work. Every empire that has used this tactic has had a variety of ways that you could mess up and receive this punishment. Naturally, in times where a woman was property and couldn't buy things, own things, or do things, or breathe without having a man side-eye her for it, this was a monumental punishment to receive. Under the Roman Empire Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a woman guilty of adultery could lose several rights as a citizen and suffer a financial burden. Noblewomen in the Kingdom of Korea during the Joseon dynasty faced a similar degradation of their societal status if they were found guilty of remarrying as a widow. This intentionally made it hard for Korean women to remarry, as they would have nothing to offer a new husband, no inherited lands or funds, and a societal belief deemed her as used goods. Even the descendants of widows of the time who had remarried faced status degradation. They were barred from ever holding office. Adulteresses in the Joseon were stripped of many of their rights and privileges once they were demoted to low-born statuses. As serious as these punishments may seem, some high-status women who committed adultery in the Joseon dynasty faced an even graver punishment, which was death. So why take someone's status from them as a criminal punishment? Well, because aside from the fact as a woman you'd essentially be left jobless, homeless, and without any family, it's because of a cheater's fama. Number 7. While fama is a Latin term for reputation and good name, every country had its own version of this fama. And if you cheated, or were even just accused of cheating in 13th century France, which by the way happened a lot because husbands just want to get rid of their wives, the woman was always the center of the punishment, even if that was the man who had been cheating. This is because the status is all a woman ever had for a very long time, and the name of her family's reputation laid on her shoulders. Thus, all that pressure to be religious, virtuous, and most importantly, a submissive woman. The customary laws of Agen province list public humiliation for both the wife and her lover as the appropriate punishment for adultery. If the man could escape before or even after arrest, he could get off without any punishment, and his partner had to face her punishment alone. The woman got no such reprieve, even if she was just the mistress he cheated on his own wife with. In fact, if she tried to escape arrest, it warranted death sentence. sentence. Women whose fama suffered through public shaming, walk of atonement, were no longer deemed honorable members of society, and seeing as standing of individuals before law at the time was often based on their reputations, what others thought of them, and how they behaved in public, she'd be left, as I said, homeless, familyless, and dejected. For my Game of Thrones people, think Cersei. Number 6 is no protection. Get your mind out of the gutter. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, there's no protection from capital punishment. While civil laws were easier to work around by just getting married alone, you can borrow money or property, you can buy things that you couldn't before and sign contracts, the criminal law didn't bend to a married woman, as she faced the same penalties as an unmarried one. Now, there are technically one exception: pregnancy, but only because it could potentially be a boy, which is insane. Additionally, all women were exempt from certain torts, such as the breaking wheel. But man, when a woman got capital punishment, it was the one and only form, and it was the most brutal and painful one: burning at the stake. By the way, they claim this was the only and the necessary option of execution for a woman, as it's a preservation of female modesty. Apparently, other forms of execution were unbecoming of a woman. Although there may be some truth to this wild justification, modern historians have rounded it down to just misogyny, as well as a deep-rooted suspicion and dislike of women as the root of this execution decision. Essentially, when given the opportunity to punish a woman, men went ham for it and wanted to see her suffer as much as possible. So women experienced the worst executions of the Dark Ages. And remember, when meeting a beloved, dress to impress, but not so much that you cause a scandal. Remember, sumptuary laws exist. It'd be pretty embarrassing to be arrested and sentenced on your first date with someone. It was advised that medieval women getting ready for a date should wear their tallest steeple hat and their best dress, and top it off with their finest linen wimple. This helped to elongate the neck. A long neck on a woman was considered beautiful. So was a bunch of other weird stuff that we'll get to in a second. Meanwhile, men should always remember on a date to wear their best gown and hose, which are pantyhose. But as said, don't dress too posh. The sumptuary laws of medieval England, such as the statute concerning diet and apparel of 1363, tried to ensure that citizens did not dress or consume above their social status. These rules included what kind of fur trims could be worn and by whom, colors, hats, patterns, shoes, and all the whole shebang. Check out our video Top 10 Unusual Medieval Laws You Never Knew Existed to learn more about sumptuary laws and laws of fashion. The rules of etiquette will most definitely help you avoid scandal when invited over to the family home of your potential lover, and they were genuinely as follows. 1. Keep your hands clean. Don't stroke the dog or the cat. Be sure to wipe your fingers on the tablecloth instead of licking them. 2. Bones are not to be gnawed, and don't pick your teeth with the sharp irons. 3. Don't eat with a fork. Forks were used to prepare food, but most medieval Europeans thought forks were an odd thing to eat with. 4. Don't eat with a knife either. Many people carried the knives on them on their belt to carve up the food before eating, but don't eat with it. 5. Okay, if it's a liquid, use a spoon. People tended to eat with their hands for everything else. 6. Don't sit too close to the salt cellar. Salt was expensive and associated with prestige, so it's a good dating tip at a big dinner to see who sat closest to the salt cellar. And 7. You can burp, but look up at the ceiling as you do so. And 8. Remember, you must not urinate at the host's premises unless you're staying overnight and it's before bed. Obviously, some of these things like wiping your hands on a tablecloth, eating without a knife, or holding your pee until it's time to go are pretty unusual to us now. But back in the Middle Ages, if you wanted that shorty and not to ruin your reputation, well, you're burping at the ceiling, bro. I hope she's worth it. Next up is how love makes you crazy. This is a fascinating wormhole to travel down, and I learned from several journal articles that lovers in the Middle Ages had a real tendency to go mad. I mean, we all know the examples. Elaine, the fair maid of Astrolot, pining away. Romeo and Juliet taking their lives, and the raving madness of Ophelia. But these are just dramatizations, right? We tend to regard accounts of love madness in medieval literature as evidence that they overestimated the strength of erotic passion. In classical and early medieval periods, sexual love was regarded as carnal appetite to be controlled. But with the rise of poetry sentiment and the theater came courtly love, which was seen as a highly spiritual desire. The idea of courtly love had more to do with the concept of loving rather than pleasure. This idealized kind of love was based on a secret union where two lovers could only love from far away. These sorts of unattainable relationships were increasingly romanticized, but in medieval society, the notion that erotic love could drive people mad may not be so unrealistic. We understand now that mental illnesses are sometimes provoked by the stress between the individual and their social environment. Think of the pressure a woman had to marry. Her whole life is purely based on existing for marriage and childbirth. The headspace created would be incredibly vulnerable to valuing all self-worth off of said marriage. If she had no suitors or faces rejection and begins to start aging out of normal marrying age, these could be detrimental to her mind. Mental illness existed in the past, this level of self-worth being carried by societal pressure that all also will punish a woman for her sexuality or existence of it should it be perceived as sinful or unwomanly is unbelievably stressful. So yeah, women primarily would literally be driven insane by marriage and their value being tied up in it. But it's okay to be crazy as long as you're hot, so let's follow these medieval beauty tips. These are actually documented tips I rounded up, so let's run through the list. First, pluck your eyebrows and move your hairline back. A high forehead was considered attractive. One hair removal recipe was a vinegar mixture with ant eggs and ivy. Yum. Second, cancel all your Mediterranean trips. You need to whiten your face. Paleness was considered beautiful, and to achieve this, some women would apply mixtures to their skin such as white lead powder mixed with sheep's fat. Weird. Third, while you're at it, hide those birthmarks and moles with homemade concealer. These blemishes were sometimes associated with witches in the Middle Ages. You may know this from our top 10 unspeakable things women went through in the Dark Ages video. One popular concoction was a face mask of bull's or hare's blood. Fourth, brunette is boring. Go blonde with organic hair dye. Flaxen hair for women was considered the most beautiful. Women who were not blonde could try a hair dye made from stale sheep's urine and saffron. If word of mouth wasn't enough to get these beauty tips to you, rest assured, Daniel of Beccles wrote a popular 13th century etiquette book. Regarding appearance, he said a man's hair should be neatly styled with a beard that was neither long nor shaggy, and nails should be attractive and teeth should be kept clean. How do you keep your teeth clean? One recipe for teeth cleaning in the Middle Ages was to mix sage leaves with salt, roll into balls, bake them into a powder, and then rub them on the teeth. Sage advice indeed. And if you do not want to be a scandalous unmarried spinster, you better listen to it. And last but not least, don't forget to bring the hemlock. Whether you're two dirty knaves trying to get down lawlessly, or a married couple who didn't want kids, hemlock was your best friend. So yes, while the medieval church made it clear that sex outside, and for some clerics inside, of marriage was sinful, the literary and documentary evidence suggests that these medieval Brits were still finding ways to be as randy as rabbits without an illegitimacy scandal. It was hemlock, a recommendation made by 13th century author Peter of Spain in his book Treasure of the Poor. Peter wrote men should rub boiled paste of hemlock on their boys before intercourse. Seeing as hemlock is poisonous, this was ballsy. Obviously they were open to whatever suggestions they could get. When Persian physician Abba BMZ Razia works was translated, Europeans gobbled up his suggestions, which was applying cedar oil onto the nether regions before intercourse for a man or after for the woman. He also said that if the woman jumps backwards after intercourse, the stuff will fall out. Seeing intercourse before marriage itself was illegal and knavery was perceived the way it was, I'm sure I don't need to explain the scandal in this one.
Kicking off the list at number 10, the big city. Okay, it's the 14th century, it's Saturday, you and the boys are off to have a hoot and or holler. You decide to hit the big city, check out one of those medieval taverns that everybody is talking about. So, what should you expect? Should you get your fake ID? Should you have your passport? Is there a bouncer? What's covered tonight? How many rupees is covered? Well, for starters, this is a long time before Ubers, so unless you have a horse or two, you're gonna have to walk quite a bit just to get to the bar. If the Black Death didn't get you, the commute into the city definitely would. Your knees would be clicking. Living in the city was horrible. Strict curfews were put into place. Violent crimes would happen all throughout the night because obviously back in those days there's no police force out patrolling. Just shady dudes in hoods. Just Big Ched would be in the corner with his hood up just planning something, you know what I mean? Number 9, house special. Many of these ale brewers were women, probably because men were too busy drinking it. Ale and bread were both necessities when it came to living in the late 12th century, because there's no Taco Bell anywhere. This food's sparse. Hunting, it's all sparse. I like saying the word sparse, it's nice. Sparse. Baking bread was not freely permitted, but making ale in your basement was. Yeah, we went from making ale in our living rooms to banning alcohol. History is wild sometimes. So the higher ups, these noble lords, they wouldn't care if you made ale and had a block party and all that jazz and made all that noise, but if you made weak ale, or if it was improperly measured and then distributed, then you would get a fine. Imagine that. That's like the police busting your house party, only when they get there, they turn the music up and congratulate you on a proper barrel of White Claw. Yes, black cherry, the finest. Number 8, don't mind the rats. Oh, what's that? You're with your friends and family, gathering around a table, eating and drinking and conversing, having a lovely time? Be a shame if hundreds of rats started to swarm your feet while you were mid-bite, wouldn't it? Welcome to the past. The plague rolled into town back in 1328, and it lasted until like 1350. It lasted a long time. It was actually horrible. We think of the plague in history and we're like, man, was that anything like the past few years? No, not at all. I haven't seen any swarms of rats lately. I haven't gotten the Black Death. the European population was reduced by 1/3, and rats were mostly to blame. Yeah, these quick hairy balls of yuck just scurrying through the town. I don't want any part of that. I don't like rats. I actually do not like rats. These little guys passed it on. Mid-meal, you would feel a tickle, look down. Oh, it's just the plague. Nice, just a couple of plagues waiting for crumbs to fall. Oh, how cute is that? Yep, just the bill, thanks. Number 7, BYOF. If you're passing by one of these middle-aged taverns, maybe you feel like grabbing some questionable lunch. Well, you better come prepared, my friend. Bring your own fork. Because we don't have any. We can't afford that. We're not blacksmith. We can't make a fork. What's a fork? We didn't have a moody server sitting in booth 11 doing roll-ups all night. This was the Middle Ages. If you had a fork, you took care of that fork. Forks don't grow on trees, pal. If you were lucky, these establishments would dish out a couple of spoons. Maybe a couple of spoons, but forks? Nice joke. You're getting laughed at. You're watching everybody eat while you starve. Historians compared sharing forks to sharing toothbrushes, so that's, in case you're wondering, no, you're not borrowing a friend's. Oh, after you're done that bite, can I just maybe? No, get out of here. See ya, off with your head. You also didn't have a steak knife handy ever. Knives were only reserved for carvers. Until the 17th century, all you had were little daggers. You would just poke and tear through your meal. You just poke it. Number 6, ins and outs. My favorite title. I've worked here for a year and a half now, it's my favorite title. When we think of a medieval tavern or an inn, it's important to note the differences. Yes, there's drinking. Yes, it smells like dad breath all throughout the air. But inns, their sole purpose was to house travelers comfortably, whereas the tavern, not so much housing, more of rough housing, you know what I mean? Taverns were almost a private event thing. Your neighbors would whip up some ale, light a candle, 2 is a company, 3 is a crowd, come on in, now we got a basement tavern fight club, let's party. It was that easy. That was a tavern. You now have a tavern. No license, no nothing, just come on in, look what I made, drink it.
Number 5, helmeted chicken. Wind the clock back 10 years ago. I was but a humble freshman in high school. I was green behind the ears. I didn't know what to expect. Sure, people had prepped me for the worst, but I just didn't know what to expect. I got even more nervous when I saw the pretty girls showing up. Gosh, they were so pretty. Someone want to be my girlfriend? But I relaxed. I knew I was okay because at lunchtime I was going to watch my favorite YouTube channel, Epic Mealtime. Besides this one, it's a good channel, you should check it out. We're awesome. They made combinations of food that I didn't even think were possible. I was absorbed into their culture, and who wasn't? Why do I bring the awkward time of 2012 back up? Well, that's because the medieval times had their own version of a turducken. Sort of. While it's not a chicken inside a duck inside a turkey inside a pig covered in bacon like EMT did, it's similar and perhaps off-putting for our veggie fans. Basically, there was a chicken sewn to a pig to look like a knight riding on a horse. And yes, I'm sure the chef washed his hands. Right?
Number 4, going to the scheduled delifing. Entertainment wasn't as accessible or the same as it is now. In modern times, we pull up our phones, turn on our laptops, sit in front of the TV, and there is all the entertainment we need, from battles to baby drama. But back in the Middle Ages, there wasn't much to do after you were done your work for the day. There were forms of entertainment, music, theater, games, sports, etc. But a favorite would have to be going to see the latest ne'er-do-well lose their head. Public shows of punishment were not just something you went to see when you were bored. Actually, their more important purpose was as a deterrent for anyone who thought of maybe committing a crime. And yeah, that would do the trick. It was also a good way to finalize the trial of a criminal for all those who were affected or who were part of the village. Eventually, they became more of a private affair, but not entirely, with the last public delifing in the United States happening in 1936. Let's not bring this one back. No, I'm good. I'll pass.
Number 3, witch trials. Speaking of scheduled delifing, witch trials, or rather, get rid of anyone who's been deemed a witch, which, in case you didn't know, was as simple as this. Right then, the young woman down the lane is smarter than her boys in the school. Right then, folks, pitchforks and torches it is. Unfortunately, for a lot of women at the time, it was tough. When has it not been, right ladies? While some men were declared witches too, this was a tool really for people with power to get rid of those who dare oppose them. There's too many royals to mention who took part in this, however, one stands out as Bloody Queen Mary. Names like this were not given for no reason. She was known for sending witches and heretics alike to the stake to be cooked.
Number 2, outlaw. In movies and TV, characters named as outlaws, specifically in the Wild West sense, are seen as cool guys, outsiders, and wanderers with an air of mystery and possibly power. Trust me when I say it was not what you want it to be, especially in the medieval times. If you were declared an outlaw in the Middle Ages, you lost all rights, possessions, and any kind of protection being part of society would give you, including people getting in trouble for ending your stay on this plane of existence. You were forced to fend for yourself with nothing to your name, and in a world rife with disease, wars, bandits, and very little readily available food or water, things get harsh quick. If you didn't have a buddy to turn to for help, who you knew for a fact would not literally stab you in the back, then you were pretty screwed. Luckily, I have Andrew. Right?
Yeah. Number 1, ladies. Okay, so let's say you're married. Husband tends the crops. You as the wife take care of the home. This isn't a statement about the patriarchy. I'm just saying taking care of the home is just as important back then. Seriously, it is. Well, your husband comes in from tending the fields one night with a fever. Uh-oh, he's fallen ill, and now he's perished. Now you're left alone with no income and a society that's probably not okay with you working. So that means it's time to pull up your pants. Well, actually pull them down, as in a scenario like this, it would be time to work that street corner, and a lot of women did do that. The same way Adam works on building Legos in his dungeon. I joke. But as they say, it's the oldest profession in the book, and folks, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Tradition or not.
Number 10. The kitchen. Now that you've got your appetite, let's talk about the kitchen. Major kitchens of the castle usually had to deal with providing at least 2 meals for several hundred people every day. As you can imagine, this is where the work would be put in. By a large staff too, usually in the hundreds. So you're sweaty from working and surrounded by a bunch of other blokes. Sounds pretty awful. But you didn't take into account the amount of heat. The guidelines on how to make enough food for a 2-day banquet include the chief cook having to at least have 1,000 cartloads of good dry firewood and a large barn full of coal to keep the fires going. It's spicy in the kitchen, let me tell you. Number 9. The main hall. The idea of a standing army wasn't exactly a thing during the medieval period, so what you would have is your knights or castle soldiers. And unless there was a barracks, the main hall would often convert to have a bunch of cots in it where these soldiers would sleep. It could also be where your guests might stay, and even your servants if you didn't have a room for either of them. And then it became your dining room. It was also your party room, and your courtroom. It was honestly a pretty versatile room, so much room for activity. You could probably imagine the amount of tomfoolery that happened here though. A large group of sweaty men and women after a feast, and they don't have to walk home because they are staying the night. Nice. Number 8. The pooper. The title says unholy, but this room's main purpose is to have a hole. A hole for people to sit their little keisters down on and drop the kids off. Sometimes down a nice long shaft through the castle that went straight to the cesspit or to the moat. If the moat was a room, I'd probably include it on this list because, yikes. A toilet isn't something you'd actually find in most medieval castles. There are easier places to do your business outside. The garderobe is basically a tiny little closet-sized room with a hole in it for this sole purpose. But they were also used for storage, like when you had visitors. You gotta put their coats and cloaks somewhere. Why not next to where Steve is trying to go potty? Number 7. Dovecotes. You know when you walk down the street and a white colored excrement falls on you from above and you look up to see a pigeon just looking down on you as if it owns your whole existence? Imagine that, times like 2,500 in a circular tower, and you've got a dovecote. These structures actually showed off status and wealth as only the lords were legally allowed to have them. Doves and pigeons proved to be an excellent source of food with their meat and eggs. Their feathers were also valuable, and yes, even their droppings found use back in the day. Doves even had religious value, being associated with the Holy Spirit. Pigeons, on the other hand, are a menace to society and need to be stopped at all costs. Thank you for listening to my PSA. Gotcha, you little rascal. You were gonna keep watching this video without slapping that like and subscribe button, weren't you? That's fine. I guess you can do that. But gee, we would really all appreciate it if you just gave those buttons a little poke. And then we can poke back with more of these videos. Deal? Alright, moving on. Number 6. The buttery. I can't believe it's not butter. Won't believe it, sister. This has nothing to do with butter. No, in fact, the name actually comes from beer butts, otherwise known as barrels. The room itself was located pretty close to the main hall, where yeomen would serve beer to the people who were too low in the ladder to be allowed to have wine. and it was usually connected to the beer cellar down below. How is this unholy? Because, I don't know about you, but I've never done a single holy thing after a few beers.
Number 5, teeth worms. Awesome, you have any cavities? Now you're gonna be looking this whole video. Dentists weren't common back in the Dark Ages, but they did have a barber. So I guess we're good for a few hundred years. This guy did it all. Cavities, toothaches, teeth worms, gross, you name it, he'll pull it out violently. Barbers were responsible for cutting hair, pulling teeth, bloodletting, your classic 3-in-1 appointment right there, really all in 10 minutes or less. Instead of brushing with tooth tunes, back then you would rub your teeth and gums with a rough linen. Yeah, just grab an old shirt. It's an old dirty shirt we're gonna brush up for school. Like you're playing a harmonica, only dirty shirt. A few recipes have been discovered since for pastes and powders to freshen their breath back then, Otherwise, you were pretty screwed. You had nothing. We went from powdered charcoal to charcoal toothpaste all over again. What a weird loop we did. Mouthwashes were also made from herbs and spices steeped in wine or vinegar, so fresh breath guaranteed, no doubt about it.
In our number 4 spot today, we have the stripes ban. We've all met someone before who seems to be concerned with what other people are wearing, and we jokingly refer to them as the fashion police. But back in the Dark Ages, you might come across some very real fashion police who are actually interested in fining you, should your finest tunic not be of the local dress code. Sometimes it wasn't even just a fine. Some serious fashion faux pas could lead to your imprisonment or even your death. Stripes were definitely a main culprit in these times, as striped clothing was seen as a garment of the devil. I'm not even exaggerating either. In the year 1310 in a French town, there was a local cobbler who was put to death because he had been caught in striped clothes. Yeah, we thought the tabloids were harsh, and they are, but the medieval fashion police were unforgiving. Not only were members of clergy not exempt from this rule, but neither were animals. Yeah, calling all zebras. Good luck out there, man. This is why zebras were called beasts of the devil, and yes, this is even though the people of Europe hadn't even seen them. Just heard tales of their striped nature.
Number 3, no rules football. In honor of the World Cup coming to a close, we have to take a look at football back in the late 12th century. Yeah, what did that look like? Or feel like, rather. Instead of corner kicks and throw-ins, you could do anything you wanted to retrieve the ball from the opposing team. Yeah, anything. Left hooks, some kicks, some jabs, throwing rocks, anything, you name it. It was violent. No diving in these games, I'll tell you that for free. You didn't have to. There was also no time limit. There was also no limit to how many players could be involved. So choose your team wisely. Pick the biggest guy, pretty much. It's town versus town a lot of the time. There's a lot of emotions out there settled on the field. And in the middle of it somewhere, there would be a soccer ball rolling around. I would call this a sport. Now finally, come 1314, King Edward II banned the game. And yeah, more than fair. All his civilians and citizens are dying. He's like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe it's not wise. I don't know.
In our number 2 spot today, we have fast medieval marriage. There are so many messed up medieval marriage practices. We could do an entire video on just that. And in fact, we have. Go check those out. But while you're here, let's talk just a bit about them. Marriage in the medieval times was quick and easy, but also difficult to prove. If you and your loved one wanted to get married, all you really needed to do was say, "We're married!" and then boom, it's done. Of course, this led to a whole pile of those spur-of-the-moment type marriages, especially considering how sex before marriage was widely condemned in these times. People are like, we're married now, let's do it. Well, I'm pretty sure many people who were divorced would have preferred if their marriages were this easy. This led to people, of course, taking advantage of this difficult to prove thing. Most especially women would often fall victim to a man who might want to take you as his wife for the night. But then the following day, after getting what he wants, he denied ever agreeing to the union of the two, if you're catching my drift. This is why many women tried to get at least one witness to union, just in case.
And finally, number 1. Pointed shoes. This one's so fun. Whenever I see anything that's related to the medieval times, I always admire the attire, right? Especially the shoes. I hate buying shoes today so much. Now they're so specific. You got walking, running, trail shoes. They're always so expensive. Nobody does it like the medieval times anymore. Specifically, krakows. Krakows were awesome. They were the style of shoe commonly worn in the 15th century Europe that looked really ridiculous. They had the long huge long nose that went up really high. They're so silly looking, maybe that's why I love them. These long-toed shoes first appeared in the 12th century, but the cracao, the thing is, these things were twice as long as your foot, and that was considered fancy back then. These meant business, so you better watch those ankles, Beth, alright? We're going into some meetings fast. They were named after the city that they were made in. Cracaos were worn by everybody at one point, but as cheeky as it sounds, the longer the shoe, the more valuable you were. There we go. So it turned into a joke eventually, right? These things got way too long and it looked ridiculous. You ever walk around in flippers beside the pool where you do that big silly walk? That's the walk that everybody was doing in town, right? It was out of hand. They would be stuffed with horsehair or moss. Yeah, which is just as comfortable as Dr. Scholl's. Imagine stepping around in moss all day. Yuck. Also, sometimes a string would be needed to be tied from the tip of the shoe to your knee just to keep these damn things afloat. So everybody at one point in time, in the medieval times, looked like a Muppet tied to strings. How amazing is that? Do you own any cracaos? If so, how do we get our hands on a pair? I'm a size 11.5 cracao. Let's make it happen. Maybe if we all pitch in as a community, I don't know, we can all be wearing cracaos tomorrow.